Welcome to the debate. We are currently looking at a 28% pay gap for autistic workers.
Yeah, and it's a 20% gap for those with learning difficulties.
Exactly. We're looking at a staggering 30 to 40% overall employment rate for neurodivergent individuals and, perhaps the most damning statistic of our modern corporate era, a 65% retention drop-off after just 1 year of employment.
It really is a massive hemorrhage of talent.
It is. So, the UK is actively moving from a voluntary baseline established in 2025 towards mandatory disability pay gap reporting by 2027. This impending shift is driven by House of Lords evidence, which is demanding a disaggregated disability taxonomy.
Right, which brings us to our essential disagreement today. Does the aggressive integration of regulatory enforcement, specifically making workplace adjustment failures a conduct breach, actually provide the accountability needed to solve this?
Right. And I argue that tying neuroinclusion to severe regulatory risk and, mandatory reporting architecture is really the only proven method to ensure equity.
And I argue that this punitive framework just creates defensive compliance. It ultimately fails to address the underlying biases that are actually driving the gap.
Well, let's start with the history here. For decades, we have treated the integration and equitable treatment of neurodivergent professionals as an exercising corporate goodwill. We relied on vague cultural initiatives, employee resource groups, and voluntary pledges.
Sure, which hasn't moved the needle enough.
Not at all. The data I just outlined proves that voluntary measures have unequivocally failed. So the 2025 to 2027 board roadmap toward mandatory alignment is not just a regulatory update, it is an essential structural intervention.
A very aggressive intervention, though.
But a necessary one. Specifically, I am pointing to the integration of the Financial Conduct Authority's PS 2523 policy statement. This is a watershed moment because it explicitly links a firm's internal culture to its external conduct risk.
Right, the SM&CR integration.
Exactly. Starting in 2026, making a neuro-inclusive failure to manage, an NFM, a formal conduct rule under the senior managers and certification regime, fundamentally rewrites the corporate power dynamic. It's not a slap on the wrist for the company anymore. It attaches personal liability directly to the senior managers involved.
Wow.
Yeah. If you, as a leader, fail to implement a necessary workplace adjustment for a neurodivergent employee, that failure is attached to your personal regulatory record. It follows you. When you tie neuroinclusion to that level of severe individualized regulatory risk backed by a mandatory reporting architecture, you finally force board-level accountability.
Okay, but
You basically elevate the livelihoods of neurodivergent talent from a localized HR complaint into a non-negotiable boardroom imperative.
look, the statistics you laid out at the beginning are horrific. We completely agree on the scale of a failure. But we are attempting to solve a crisis of human complexity using the blunt, unyielding instruments of financial auditing.
I wouldn't call it unyielding.
I think it is, and that is a profound misdiagnosis of the problem. Authentic equity is not achieved at the end of a regulatory stick. It's found in voluntary tracking logic.
But we just established that voluntary measures failed.
When organizations genuinely, voluntarily redesign their structures to be neuro-inclusive, we actually see higher disclosure rates and robust talent attraction. We see the actual realization of the cognitive dividend, the immense, unique problem-solving capabilities that neurodivergent minds bring to the table.
Sure, when it works.
Right, but by relying on a rigid reporting architecture, which means standardized taxonomies, independent auditing, and automatic regulatory triggers for any pay gap over 5%, we are setting a trap. When you threaten a firm with severe consequences for discovering a gap, you don't get transparency.
You get compliance.
No, you get discovery shock. Companies will suddenly realize they have massive discrepancies, and out of terror of the FCA, they will manage the numbers, not the culture. They will hyperfixate on passing the audit. They'll find loopholes to mathematically close the gaps on paper, while entirely ignoring the actual insidious drivers of the progression gap, which are deeply rooted in recruitment and subjective appraisal bias.
But let's look at how that regulatory stick actually operates in practice. because the mechanism of enforcement is precisely what prevents companies from simply ignoring those underlying biases.
How so?
Under the SMNGR framework, an adjustment failure transitions from a minor administrative delay into a formal conduct breach. Regulatory references must now explicitly include an NFM, that neuro-inclusive failure to manage.
Right.
If a senior manager actively denies a necessary workplace adjustment, they are essentially telling the regulator that they cannot be trusted to manage human capital or systemic risk.
That's a massive escalation.
It is, and the threat of personal liability forces the issue into the light. It demands that neuro-inclusion is managed with the exact same operational rigor and, frankly, daily vigilance as financial compliance.
I come at it from a different way. That analogy to financial compliance perfectly illustrates why this mandatory architecture is so dangerous when applied to human beings.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. We do not apply the logic of voluntary cultural growth to any other high-stakes corporate environment.
I mean,
Take anti-money laundering regulations, for example. We don't rely on voluntary tracking logic or the promise of an ESG advantage to prevent financial crimes. We use strict liability. We use personal accountability.
but people aren't money.
We recognize that human nature, when left unchecked in a corporate hierarchy, will cut corners to save time or resources. Why should protecting the livelihoods, the mental health, and the equitable pay of neurodivergent workers be treated with less regulationary severity than a financial spreadsheet?
Because it's not a spreadsheet.
A 28% pay gap is a systemic failure. You cannot organically grow your way out of a systemic failure. You have to legislate it out. The threat of an NFM conduct breach provides the necessary friction to force managers to actively learn and apply the tools available to them.
Yeah, but that's the issue. Money laundering is an objective, binary financial event. A transaction is either legal or it is illegal.
Sure.
Human neurobiology and the specific accommodations required for an individual to thrive in a workplace is not a binary financial transaction. It is highly contextual, it's deeply individualized, and constantly evolving.
Nobody is saying it isn't complex.
But when you weaponize inclusion by attaching personal liability to a manager's actions under the SMNCR, you do not create a rigorous culture. You create a culture of terror.
Terror is a strong word.
Think about the psychological mechanism at play here. If I am a middle manager and I am told that failing to perfectly navigate the highly complex needs of a neurodivergent employee could result in a formal conduct breach on my permanent record, my immediate instinct is self-preservation. I manage defensively.
But the expectation isn't perfection. The expectation is engagement. The National Workforce Advisory Forum, the NWAF, has explicitly developed the neuro-inclusion license to manage syllabus for this exact reason.
Right. The NWAF tools?
Yeah, it gives managers the education they need to engage properly.
And it is a brilliant, empowering educational tool. But under this punitive FCA integration, managers won't view that syllabus as an empowering guide to harness the cognitive dividend. They will view neurodivergent employees as walking regulatory risks.
That's pretty cynical.
It's human nature. Instead of actively recruiting neurodivergent talent to build innovative teams, managers will quietly, subtly chill talent attraction. They will find unstated ways to avoid hiring individuals who might inadvertently trigger a personal liability investigation if an adjustment process goes sideways.
So they'll just hide from the issue.
Exactly. Fear of punishment breeds risk aversion. You are incentivizing managers to distance themselves from the very talent pool you are trying to protect.
But that risk aversion only exists if managers can hide their hiring practices, which they can no longer do because of the measurement requirements. This brings us to the reporting architecture itself.
The taxonomy.
Yes. The House of Lords 2025 evidence explicitly advocated for a disaggregated disability taxonomy, an ISEE 3000 assurance for the data. Let's unpack how that functions.
Go ahead.
For decades, companies have hidden their autism pay gaps, or their dyspraxia pay gaps, inside a massive aggregated disability metric. A company could proudly claim they are excelling at disability inclusion because they have robust physical accessibility infrastructure.
While ignoring neurodiversity.
Exactly, while simultaneously sustaining a 30% pay gap for their autistic staff. By demanding a disaggregated taxonomy, the regulation forces companies to separate the data. And the ISAE 3000 assurance isn't just a casual check.
It's an audit standard.
Right, it's a rigorous standard for non-financial data auditing that requires companies to prove their data collection methods are tamper-proof. This creates a clear, undeniable snapshot alignment. It forces the reality out of the shadows and necessitates mandatory action plans.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. The pursuit of data integrity through rigid classifications is like trying to capture smoke in a net.
How so? The categories are pretty well defined?
Standardized taxonomies inherently fail when they collide with the reality of intersectionality. How does your tamper-proof ISA 3000 assurance audit account for an autistic woman of color who also has ADHD and dyspraxia?
Well, she would be represented in the intersecting datasets.
But which rigid, disaggregated box does she go into primarily so the company can generate its snapshot alignment? The taxonomy forces individuals to reduce their complex, multifaceted lived experiences into highly specific audit categories just to satisfy a compliance dashboard. You are forcing human complexity into an Excel spreadsheet.
The taxonomy isn't designed to reduce their humanity. It is designed to ensure they are visible to the system.
Visible to an auditor, maybe?
Without categorized data, systemic inequality remains completely invisible to the people who hold the power to fix it.
But the visibility you are mandating is artificially constructed to feed the audit triggers, and those triggers will cause active harm. Let's look at the actual mechanism of these regulations.
The 5% threshold.
Right. The architecture includes strict audit triggers for any pay gap greater than 5%. When the 2027 mandatory alignment hits, organizations are going to experience massive discovery shock. They will run the new taxonomy, look at their data, and realize they have a 25% pay gap for specific neurodivergent profiles.
Which they should have to fix.
But what is the immediate corporate response when that audit trigger is tied to severe regulatory risk and public shaming? It is not to embark on a multi-year, deep dive cultural transformation to address implicit bias. The response is to manipulate the math through quartile clustering.
Independent auditing is specifically designed to detect and penalize mathematical manipulation.
Auditors verify the data against the parameters they are given. Let me explain how quartile clustering actually happens on the ground.
Okay.
A company sees an audit trigger approaching. To close the pay gap on paper, human resources doesn't organically promote neurodivergent talent to executive leadership. Instead, they artificially move people around the margins.
By tweaking salaries.
Yeah, they take a group of mid-level neurodivergent employees sitting at the top of the second pay quartile, and they give them just enough of a fractional raise to push them into the bottom of the third pay quartile.
And the average shifts.
Exactly. The overall average shifts. The math problem is solved. The audit trigger is avoided. But those employees gained no actual authority, no real career progression, and no meaningful increase in compensation. This is the taxonomy trap.
I see the concern.
You measure the categories perfectly, you pass the ISAE 3000 assurance, but you completely abandon the human beings trapped inside the system.
You are assuming companies will expend more energy architecting elaborate mathematical illusions than simply implementing the mandatory action plans. Let's talk about the human beings trapped in the system, specifically regarding the progression gap.
Please.
Because this is where the theoretical debate hits the daily reality of the workplace. We are both looking at the horrific 65% retention drop-off after 1 year. That is a hemorrhage of talent that mathematical tricks cannot hide forever.
That hemorrhage is the core of the issue, but it is not caused by a lack of ISA 3000 assurance. It is caused by the brutal reality of the progression gap. Neurodivergent individuals enter the workforce often highly qualified, and they hit a wall at month 8 or month 10.
Due to management failures.
Due to recruitment bias and, more insidiously, appraisal bias. A mandatory 2027 alignment does not rewrite human behavior during a mid-year performance review. Let's look at the mechanism of a standard appraisal.
Sure.
If an autistic employee's manager subconsciously equates leadership potential with, say, prolonged eye contact, aggressive vocal dominance in meetings, and seamless small talk, no standardized taxonomy in the world is going to get that employee promoted.
They'll just cite culture fit.
Exactly. The employee is continually given vague feedback about lacking culture fit or executive presence. The reporting architecture just creates pristine paperwork documenting their stagnation. True equity requires voluntary tracking logic that fosters deep cultural understanding, empathy, and a fundamental restructuring of how we define merit. You cannot audit empathy into a middle manager.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I concede that you cannot audit empathy into existence. But my argument is that the regulatory framework provides the structural tools to bypass that human bias entirely.
How do you bypass the manager?
We do not need to rely on a manager's subjective empathy if we have objective, hardwired governance. Look at the mechanisms provided by the NWAF that are being integrated into this roadmap.
The passports.
Right, the implementation of digital adjustment passports and AI-ready governance documents, coupled with the 50 by 35 target, the goal of reaching 50% neurodivergent employment representation by 2035, this architecture fundamentally alters the power dynamic in that performance review.
A digital adjustment passport is just a PDF if the organizational culture doesn't inherently respect the person holding it.
It is infinitely more than a PDF under this regulatory regime. Because of the SMNCR and the threat of an NFM conduct breach, the digital adjustment passport operates as a binding contract of necessary accommodation.
Okay, trace that out.
Let's trace the mechanism. The passport makes adjustments universally portable across the organization. An employee doesn't have to continuously redisclose their trauma, their sensory needs, or their communication style every time the company restructures or they get a new boss. Which is a good thing, yes.
It is standardized, and crucially, it is AI-ready for governance tracking. This strips the excuse of appraisal bias away from management. If a manager attempts to give a poor performance review based on a lack of vocal dominance in meetings, but the employee's digital adjustment passport explicitly stipulates asynchronous written communication as a recognized adjustment,
The AI catches it.
yes, the AI governance system cross-references the review against the passport's metadata. It flags the incongruence, it blocks the subjective review from finalizing because it violates the established parameters. It immediately elevates the bias to a strict regulatory issue rather than a subjective debate over culture fit. We entirely remove the manager's ability to act on their bias. I understand the mechanics of what you are proposing, but have you considered the incredibly transactional, almost dystopian nature of what you just described?
Dystopian?
You are replacing a nuanced human relationship, the relationship between a manager and their team member, with a digital passport and an AI governance block.
It's protection.
Yes, preventing the exhaustion of constant redisclosure is vital, but when you mandate this interaction under the constant threat of personal liability and algorithmic enforcement, you reduce the neurodivergent employee to a set of operational inputs. The interaction basically becomes, here is my passport, these are my required parameters, please process my labor without violating an FCA rule.
If the alternative is the current reality, where the employee is subjected to unchecked, subjective appraisal bias and inevitably becomes part of that 65% attrition statistic, then I will gladly take the transactional protection of operational parameters. Protection must precede cultural enlightenment.
But protection through operational parameters ensures compliance becomes the ceiling rather than the floor. We must aim for the realization of the cognitive dividend.
Which takes too long voluntarily.
The companies that are actually closing their progression gaps right now aren't doing it because they are terrified of a 2027 audit or an AI blocking their performance reviews. They're doing it through voluntary tracking logic. They realize that traditional appraisal metrics, like unstructured interviews or highly subjective networking assessments, are fundamentally broken for everyone, not just neurodivergent people.
True, they are broken.
By voluntarily redesigning those systems to focus on objective output rather than performative neurotypical behavior, they attract top-tier talent. They gain a massive ESG advantage. They build resilient, highly innovative teams. When you force this through the FCA, you crowd out the intrinsic motivation to genuinely evolve. Companies stop trying to build better teams and start trying to build better compliance shields.
The macro-level data simply does not support the premise that intrinsic motivation is sufficiently widespread to solve a crisis of this magnitude. If voluntary ESG advantages and the promise of the cognitive dividend were enough to drive systemic change, we wouldn't be sitting here discussing a 28% pay gap today.
Change takes time.
Time we don't have. The 2025 baseline exists to capture the stark reality of our current failure, and the 2027 mandatory alignment exists because waiting for corporate culture to organically evolve is a luxury that the 65% of neurodivergent people losing their jobs every single year simply do not have.
And my fear remains that in our rush to build this rigid reporting architecture, we will measure the gaps with absolute precision while doing absolutely nothing to close the psychological and cultural distance between neurotypical and neurodivergent professionals.
I hear that.
We will have perfectly disaggregated taxonomies and flawlessly managed quartile clusters, but the underlying alienation will persist, neatly documented and permanently filed in an AI-ready governance system.
Well, to summarize my position, the severity of the neurodivergent employment crisis demands structural intervention. The 28% pay gap and the 30 to 40% overall employment rate cannot be solved by goodwill alone.
So you stand by the mandatory framework?
Completely. The strict regulatory architecture of the 2025-2027 roadmap remains the only viable mechanism to force change. By utilizing the FCA to mandate equity and attaching personal liability through the SM&CR to adjustment failures, we compel organizations to treat neuro-inclusion with the operational rigor and urgency it has always deserved.
While I believe an over-reliance on audit triggers and conduct breaches fundamentally risks creating a landscape of defensive management, the true value of neurodivergent talent is best achieved by focusing on the complex, nuanced drivers of the progression gap.
Like appraisal bias?
Exactly. Human realities like intersectionality and subconscious appraisal bias defy rigid taxonomies. Forcing them into standardized audit boxes invites data manipulation and discovery shock, rather than fostering the deep cultural shifts required for authentic equity.
Yet, despite this fundamental divide on the mechanisms of enforcement, we share critical areas of alignment. We both recognize the sheer urgency of the retention crisis. A 65% drop-off after year one is a catastrophic systemic failure that demands immediate action from every level of leadership.
We do. And we also agree on the immense value of the structural frameworks developed by the NWAF. Tools like the digital adjustment passports and the license to manage syllabi are vital innovations for the modern workforce.
Absolutely.
Our disagreement lies not in their utility, but in whether their adoption should be driven by the regulatory stick of the FCA or the cultural carrot of the cognitive dividend.
We are witnessing a profound transition, moving from the realm of voluntary ESG initiatives into the hard reality of mandatory governance. As organizations navigate the shift toward the 2027 alignment, they must rigorously examine the foundation of their corporate environments. When we build the human architecture of our workforce, the question remains: are we merely complying with the stress tests to pass an external inspection, or are we genuinely designing structures strong enough to support the full weight and complexity of human diversity?